Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Some White Guy Mansplains Intersectional Feminism with Jake Ryan. I'm your host, Jake Ryan, and today we're going to talk about gender roles. Men and women have vastly different lived experiences as a direct result of living under patriarchy. While many differences are positioned as innate differences because of biology, most are actually socially conditioned. The idea of gender is baked into our society so well that people tend not to notice. A baby's sex can be known late in the first trimester of pregnancy, as early as 10 to 12 weeks, and from there, people put a whole bunch of expectations on the developing fetus based on what society has decided to expect of people with a penis versus those with a vulva. Sex and gender are often treated like interchangeable terms, but they are different things. Sex is generally considered biological and refers to a person's genitals, hormones, and chromosomes, while gender is socially constructed. If your baby is born with a vulva, it does not necessarily mean they will identify as a woman and be attracted to men, but cisnormativity and heteronormativity suggest they will. From infancy, boy and girl babies are treated differently, and they're encouraged to engage in gender-specific play. Boys are allowed to climb on things and be wild adventurers, but cannot play with dolls because those are for girls, while girls are encouraged to play house and make nice. The difference being that boys are granted independence, while collaboration and caretaking are expected of girls. As they age, the different expectations become even more pronounced. In puberty, the world opens for boys and closes for girls. Before going any further, it feels important to note that masculinity and femininity are man-made ideas. They're socially constructed, meaning they are not naturally occurring social categories, but that they exist because we gave them meaning. Men and women are positioned to be polar opposites in every way, including behavior, appearance, and disposition. With regards to appearance, men are to have body hair and women are not. Women are to have long hair on their heads. They paint their nails and wear clothes that signify their sex, leaving no doubt that they are distinct from men. An example involving disposition is that men are expected to never yield, while women are expected to always yield. Furthermore, gender roles create a predator-prey dynamic because men are taught to aggressively go after whatever they want and that it's theirs for the taking anyway, while women are supposed to be small, docile, and acquiesce to whatever a man wants. Ultimately, gender is all performance. This conditioning runs so deep that people think it's natural, but masculinity is neither innate nor specific to men, just as femininity is neither innate nor specific to women. One example of how it's all performance is how I, as a gay man, am allowed to enjoy music by Mariah Carey, Whitney Houston, and Ariana Grande. Heterosexual men are expected to distance themselves from femininity in their behavior and preferences. If a man admits to liking these singers, his heterosexuality is called into question because he's not adequately performing heteromasculinity, which, again, is just an idea and not a real thing. As a result of living under patriarchy, masculinity is both centered and highly valued, and you don't have to look very far to find proof of this. Football is the first example that comes to mind for me. In the NFL, cis men are performing hypermasculinity. They're big, strong, and tough, things that all men are taught to be, but that not all men actually are. Drag, on the other hand, is also often performed by cis men, but they're performing hyperfemininity, which is not valued or centered because it's not what's expected of men. Men are celebrated and socially rewarded for performing masculinity, but men who perform femininity tend to be mocked, criticized, and ostracized. Author Warren Farrell in his 1993 book, The Myth of Male Power, says that team names indicate what's valued. The Minnesota Vikings, for example, are named after a group of people who are known for being explorers and warriors. He notes that the Atlanta Braves are called that and not the Atlanta Sensitives, which would register as more feminine. Femininity is undervalued at every turn. Now, the Barbie movie was a great introduction to feminism for lots of people, but it also got a lot of hate from people who intended to misunderstand it. However, America Ferrera's monologue calling out the impossible double standards women faced made a lot of women feel very seen. It unabashedly centered women, which was fitting for the Barbie movie, and yet men lost their minds at being decentered in a sad effort to recenter men's experiences. The movie depicted a matriarchal society that ignored the Ken's needs, not to suggest how it should be, but to flip the script on how men experience the world. Upon leaving Barbie world and entering the real world, Barbie notes an undercurrent of violence and feeling objectified. I think the threat of violence and getting their period at a young age contribute heavily to this idea that girls mature faster than boys. Being told at roughly 11 years old that they're going to get their period every month for the next 40 years, but won't be allowed to use it as justification for doing less, would likely be pretty impactful. To be told around that time, too, that they need to be cautious of boys their age, older teen boys, and adult men, because they all may have bad intentions, would similarly mature girls. Boys have no comparable experiences, and I'm not suggesting they should, but it instills a hypervigilance in women that many men will never experience themselves. When this threat of violence is brought up, many men claim, not all men, ignoring the reality that it's enough men that women need to always be on guard because they don't know which men do wish to harm them. Additionally, there are too many men that will allow other men to harm women without ever stepping up to intervene. For a gender who claims their societal value comes from being protectors, men often fail to protect women from harm perpetrated by other men. I'll have a later episode that addresses femicide, but unfortunately, that's not the only problem women face in relationships with men. Among these relational challenges, women are conditioned to say sorry a lot more, to be subservient, and, like I talked about in last week's episode on white supremacy, this again comes down to the idea of right to space. Under patriarchy, men have it, and women don't. Women, then, are expected to go above and beyond to offset their intrusion into men's spaces and appease men. An additional challenge is that, from a young age, girls are taught that being nice is the most important thing. It exploits their compassion and tells them that providing emotional labor for men is their primary task. However, women are not unpaid therapists. In April 2018, author Carmen Maria Machado posted on her Instagram, "Hi, today, please meditate on how easily we accept women's pain as collateral damage in men's self-discovery. It's great if and when men grow in their relationships, but it should not ever be at a woman's expense, or anyone else's for that matter. And that we treat this as normal happenstance is quite a red flag." Another point Farrell made in his book is that men need to be socialized more similarly to women, including being taught emotional intelligence. He said that when we lived in societies where men might be sent off to war at any time, it made sense for men not to learn to be attached to themselves or others because their role was to be willing to lay down their lives to protect women and children. We no longer live in such a society. Men who want to join the military can do so, but otherwise, men need to be able to form lasting emotional connections, and, as it stands, Most boys are not raised with this skill set. Yet another challenge in heterosexual relationships is that of weaponized incompetence. Women are not inherently better at domestic labor, and it's offensive to pretend that they are. When a man is involved with housework or child rearing, it's often said that he's helping, implying that it's women's work. A dad is not babysitting when watching his own kids, he's being a parent. And when he contributes to chores, he's just doing his share. I'm paraphrasing here, but in her TED Talk, We Should All Be Feminists, Chimamanda Adichie says, how are you going to call yourself the superior sex when you outsource basic life skills like cooking to women? If the women in your life stopped feeding you, you'd die. It's past time for us to move beyond a gender division of labor and look at dividing tasks equally and playing to strengths, which is what same-sex couples do. Men have just as much of an obligation to tend to their relationship itself, as well as things like meals, laundry, and other everyday responsibilities that are part of being an adult. The final relationship challenge I want to address is that when women get a serious diagnosis, they're often warned from medical staff that their husband might leave them for it. It shook me when I learned this a few years ago, and it's still somewhat incomprehensible to me. This is the world we live in. That said, men are not generally taught under patriarchy how to be an equal partner with a woman, but rather that he deserves to be tended to. Men don't often know how to do the hard work of staying. A big part of this is that we are taught to think of ourselves as fixers and not to see the value in simply holding space. A sick partner can make a man feel like he failed as a protector, and he may feel the need to exit the relationship to escape his failing. How things are framed influences how we experience them, and a wife's role is framed as that of sex object, status symbol, and the husband's only deep emotional connection. Men try to pick women who will make them look good to their peers, and then they become dependent on them. So when a woman becomes unable to do what he expects of her, he'll try to replace her. Men remarry much faster after divorce or their wife's death than do women, in big part because their romantic relationships with women are the only source of emotional connection cishet men feel they have available to them. Women don't need men as much, at least as long as they aren't stepping up, and, statistically speaking, a woman is most likely to be killed by an intimate partner, so staying single is not such a bad choice for many women. Marriage provides a lot more for heterosexual men than it does for heterosexual women. As for viewing women as sex objects, I think porn plays a huge role here. Now, I don't think porn is inherently problematic, though some porn is more ethical than other kinds. My main point here is that it offers a fantasy. Women are not one-dimensional. This should go without saying, but they have their own thoughts, fears, hopes, and dreams, and don't exist simply to put your dick in. Porn isn't even so much about female pleasure, but female subordination, and when men expect women in real life to act like women in porn, they're setting themselves up for disappointment. It caused an uproar on social media earlier this year when most women said they'd rather encounter a bear in the forest than a man they didn't know. A lot of men said really misogynistic things, like wishing they would encounter a bear and get torn to shreds, proving why women chose the bear. Even in this hypothetical, men felt threatened by not being chosen, while many women said they would fear an unknown man's intentions. One female friend told me she's less afraid of the bear because it's not going to rape or torture her. At worst, it may maul or kill her, and even that's not guaranteed. But men's capacity to inflict psychological and physical pain on others with seemingly no concern for their victims was a terrifying prospect to her. Men can struggle with being decentered because they don't have their own personal identity. They align themselves with power and flail when it feels like they've lost that power because they haven't been taught to figure out who they are. Interestingly, it's the minoritized person in a binary like the sex gender binary that has a more fully formed identity. Women typically know who they are because the world is constantly trying to tell them who to be, and they get to consider whether they see themselves in that or not. A big part of that is this focus on the male gaze, which centers the attention of men as something to aspire to. This also reinforces the objectification of women, or the expectation that they should look good for men. Women aren't paid as much as men, and yet are expected to present themselves in ways men will enjoy. Makeup is expensive. Women's clothes and shoes are more expensive than men's clothes, and getting your hair and nails done is also expensive. This is referred to as the pink tax. Additionally, they have to pay for period products, even though many women would greatly prefer to not have a period. And even more troublesome is the fact that many tampons include harmful chemicals that increase women's risk for otherwise preventable health conditions. Comedian Michelle Wolf points out that the Dove campaign, "Everyone is beautiful," was sweet but misguided because it still reinforced the idea that being beautiful is the most important thing a woman can be. She jokes that we only expect unattractive women to develop practical skills, but regardless of a woman's attractiveness or skill set or lack thereof, women's lives aren't auditions to be your wife. There are some women, now referred to as pick-me's, who do buy into patriarchy and bash other women, mistakenly believing that throwing other women under the bus will somehow benefit her, that in doing so, a man will pick her. This behavior is seen among every minoritized group. One of the tools of systems of oppression is division. If you teach people to see other in-group members as their enemy, they'll hold themselves down and don't need as much outside force to be dominated. TERFs, or trans exclusionary radical feminists, do this, but it's important to remember that if your feminism doesn't include all women, then it's trash. I also don't truly believe TERFs are feminists. They think they're protecting womanhood by focusing on biology, but in doing so, they ignore the wide variety of experiences that women have and their collective needs. I want to wrap this up with a few final points. Among these points is that how we talk about women matters. Language can easily be used to dehumanize, even if that doesn't seem like the intent. To men, that is, who are taught to always believe the best of other men. Oftentimes, you'll see men refer to women as females, which is kind of gross because it ignores their personhood. Female is a scientific identifier, like if you want to talk about female frogs, or, when applied to humans, a female scientist or female CEO. But unless you're using an identifier, refer to them as women. They're people and deserve to be spoken about like humans. There's also the infantilization of women by referring to them as girls. Girls are, by definition, under age 18, and human females age 18 and older are women. I would encourage you to notice over the next week or so, in music, movies, TV shows, and even everyday conversation, how often you and the people around you use the word girls when they mean women. I also want to touch on misogyny versus misandry. Misogyny is real, and it's defined as the dislike of, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against women. Now, perhaps a lot of people may not think they're misogynistic, but you don't have to look very hard to find that misogyny is present in just about any setting. Look at the comments on pretty much any Instagram post. Even when women aren't mentioned, it's pretty common to find bitter guys dragging females. They'll take a joke and find a way to turn it into excuse to vent their socially conditioned contempt for women. And then, of course, they have the audacity to turn around and complain about the so-called male loneliness epidemic, wondering why women wouldn't want to engage with them when all they do is spew hate towards them. Somehow, a lot of men are surprised that women don't want to sign up for this, but it makes sense to me. French blogger Pauline Armange said, "Misandry and misogyny cannot be compared, quite simply because the former exists only in reaction to the latter." Professor Marc Ouellet says that misandry lacks the systemic, transhistoric, institutionalized, and legislated antipathy of misogyny. I'd like to add that misandry isn't resulting in men's deaths the way that misogyny leads to women's murders, which we'll cover more in an episode on sexual violence and femicide. The last thing I want to say is that feminism is often said to be about equality, and I want to posit that we should be looking for gender equity. Just like how I said in the last episode that our society was built with white people in mind, so too was it made for men. Bathrooms are just one example. I went to a concert a few years ago and noticed that when I had to go to the bathroom, I only had to wait about 90 seconds to get into the bathroom. I was able to go and get back to my seat and enjoy the concert pretty quickly. The line for the women's bathroom was so long, I believe women were waiting about 30 to 40 minutes in line. And that's pretty messed up because they paid just as much to be at that concert and should get to enjoy it as much as I did and not have to plan to spend 30 to 40 minutes in line for the bathroom. So in this example, equality would look like the same number of bathrooms, whereas gender equity might mean having 3 or 4 times as many women's bathrooms so that they can get through just as quickly as men. That's just one example, but there are lots of ways we could be doing better. However, I'm just a man, so I'm not going to see the ways our society fails women nearly as easily. Most of what I know is because the women in my life have been willing to share their experiences with me. I know that women know what they need better than I ever could, and I trust that they're well suited to create a more compassionate and equitable world because they see how this one isn't made for them. As they say, we should be grateful women just want equality and not revenge. Until next time, I'm Jake Ryan, and this has been Some White Guy Mansplains Intersectional Feminism.